This lesson is about defining bias and how we recognize it. What does it look like in action? So first, what is bias? By definition, bias is a tendency, inclination, or prejudice toward or against something. It's how you feel about something and how that's shown through what you do, what you think, and what you say. The first thing to know is that bias gets a bad rap in our society. We always hear things, we hear people say, oh, he's so biased. Well, the one thing we have to sort of keep in mind is that bias is natural. It's normal. It simply means that we all have bias because we all experience the world in our own unique way, which makes us look at the world, everything we see, everything we encounter, we look at through a lens. And that's unique to every one of us. We're all going to have opinions, and we're all going to see things in a certain way based on our own experiences, based on our own viewpoints, based on the way we were raised, based on the experiences we've had. Bias is very natural. But even though it's normal, we have to be aware of it, and we have to be wary of it, because everything we read or view or encounter, we look at through our own lens, through our own bias. And everything we communicate to other people is tinged by that bias. We're going to communicate in a certain way because of our own bias. And also the listener, whoever's on the other end of our communication, is going to have their bias. And so the way we approach the world, the way we see the world, is what we call bias. And we have to be aware of it in order to be better consumers and producers of information. So how do we notice bias? Well, first of all, there's a lot of different ways bias shows up, but three of the most basic. Number one is placement, right? So when you're crafting something, when you're creating a piece of writing, what do you put first versus what do you put last? That might show your bias. What you put first is maybe what you think is most important. When you're reading a news story, the first bit of information that is there is going to show some bias because somebody chose to put that first versus last. We can also show our bias when we choose what to put in versus what to leave out. Sometimes news is showing bias not because of what's on the page, but what's not on the page. If I am writing an article about a news event and I choose to leave out a certain detail, that's making a decision that is potentially based on my bias, right? I might say, oh yeah, that makes this look bad, so I'm going to leave that out. That's showing my bias. But most importantly, and what we want to focus on here, is how our language choices show bias. So let's look at some specifics. Bias language is called slanters. So you'll hear me use those two terms interchangeably. And they're called slanters because they're slanted, right? They lean in a certain direction or the other. You can't see me, but I'm making my arm go back and forth like a lever, leaning. And there's a lot of different types of slanted language, but we're going to focus in particular on three of them today. Labeling or naming, hyperbole, which you're probably familiar with, and innuendo. So the first one is labeling or naming. We show bias through the way we label or name something, what we call something, how we describe it. We use words that have positive or negative connotations. And those positive or negative connotations that come from those words show our bias. So for example, we might say pre-owned vehicle if we want to make it sound good, or we might say used car if we want to make it sound bad. Both those terms can refer to the same thing, but our bias, how we feel about that concept, is going to change the way we label it. We might use the term rebel if we agree with somebody's viewpoint, if we agree with their actions, we might call them an insurgent if we disagree with them. We might call something a game, or we might call it an athletic competition. Whichever word we use to describe that same event changes the way it's perceived, and we might use it based on how we feel about it. If we call something a game, it doesn't sound that important. If we call something an athletic competition, it's given a status. It's given some importance. Now, these three examples aren't really a big deal. They're not very heavy topics. But what happens when we use labeling for topics that people get a little bit more emotional over? So, for example, if we're talking about abortion and the debate on that, whether somebody is called pro-life or pro-choice, the term life has certain connotations to it, and we would think the opposite of pro-life would be pro-death, right? Pro-choice, choice implies a certain connotation, a positive connotation that people who call themselves pro-choice want to have associated with their position. Death penalty is a phrase we could use, but that word death is really heavy, so we might use capital punishment instead. This one you'll hear a lot in the news today with what's going on. Do we call a group of people protesters, or do we call them rioters? Or do we call them activists? I think we can all see how some of them have very positive connotations, like activists. We tend to think of activist as a very good thing. Rioters are definitely a bad connotation. Protester may be kind of somewhere in the middle. But the words we choose to describe what's happening shows our bias. This is important because when we read or view things, it helps to recognize when other people are using this type of slanted language. It helps us see that they are looking through a particular lens, and it helps us to interpret their information in a meaningful way. Another type of slanted language is hyperbole, and you guys are familiar with this one already from your previous English classes. Hyperbole is when we use highly connotative language to exaggerate what we're saying. And so right here, this horse is our sort of go-to example of hyperbole. It's an exaggeration. I'm so hungry I could eat a horse. This horse doesn't like that idea very much. But we use this type of language all the time in common conversation. So here's a couple of other examples. Pandemic teaching is killing us. I've told you to clean your room 1,000,000 times. The news hit me over the head and knocked me out. In none of those cases do we mean these things literally. We are exaggerating. When we say it is killing us, we mean it's stressing us out and making us tired. If I've told you to clean your room 1,000,000 times, I'm meaning that I've told you over and over again, but the million is the exaggeration. If I say the news hit me over the head and knocked me out, I mean that I was surprised by it because it hit me over the head, and I was just floored by it. I say it knocked me out, it had a huge effect on me. That's hyperbole. And that type of language, whether it's as obvious as the horse or it's as common as saying I've told you 1,000,000 times, we have to be on the lookout for it because people will use hyperbolic language in ways that can show their bias and might be manipulative. Finally, innuendo. And you should recognize innuendo because it is one of our vocab unit 1 words. Innuendo is when you imply something without saying it directly. So many jokes are based on innuendos. In fact, oftentimes innuendos are used in our society for things that might be a little bit uncomfortable or might be a little bit adult content or dirty. So we've got good old Michael Scott, when "that's what she said" is used as a joke, it's an innuendo. It requires you getting that innuendo to make the joke. But if we look at some less obvious implications of innuendos, William and Mary have been hanging out a lot recently, if you know what I mean. The innuendo here is that something's going on between them, right? But we're not coming out and saying it. We're just saying, well, they've been hanging out a lot lately. The innuendo is implied. Another example would be if a candidate running for office says, "You need to be careful who you choose. You want a president who will be ready on day one." Well, the innu being made there is that they will be, and their opponent won't be. They're not coming right out and attacking that opponent with this statement, but they're implying it. They're making an innuendo. So those are 3 examples of slanted language that shows our bias. And our next step is to look for bias in action. At this time, go to Schoology and find the activity Recognizing Bias to try this out on your own.